Listen carefully to what was said, and more importantly, to what wasn't. In a recent public discussion, officials talked confidently about Chinese fighter jets, Pakistan's partnership with China, and how technology sharing has strengthened military ties. On the surface, it sounded calm, controlled, almost routine, like everything was proceeding exactly as planned. But there was a silence hanging over the conversation. No one directly addressed the combat outcomes everyone was already whispering about. No clear acknowledgement of what actually happened in the air. No straight answer about losses, performance, or consequences. Just carefully chosen words, smooth transitions, and a quick move on to the next topic. That silence is the crack. Because when nothing goes wrong, leaders don't dodge specifics. They don't change the subject. They don't suddenly rush announcements, purchases, and policy shifts. Calm systems don't scramble. Think of it like a school exam. If a student aces the test, they show the paper proudly. If they fail badly, they talk about how grades don't define intelligence and quickly leave the room. The behavior tells you more than the words. This video is about that exact moment. When the story being told no longer matches reality on the ground. Not because of one speech or one interview, but because denial has a shelf life. And once it expires, decisions start getting made very fast. So here's the core question we're going to follow all the way through this story. If nothing went wrong, why is everyone suddenly scrambling? That scramble is where the real story begins. And to understand it, we have to look at what those air combat results actually changed. Psychologically, strategically, and politically. Air combat isn't just about who wins a dogfight. It's about what everyone believes happened afterward. When reports began circulating about fighters being shot down, some confirmed, some denied, some carefully avoided, the immediate damage wasn't only to hardware. Jets can be replaced. What can't be easily repaired is confidence, especially the kind of confidence that holds an air force together during a crisis. Even a single modern fighter lost in combat sends shockwaves. These aircraft aren't tanks or trucks. Each one represents years of training, billions of dollars, and an entire chain of planners, engineers, and pilots who trusted that system with their lives. Losing several, whether officially admitted or not, forces every commander to ask a terrifying question. What else did we get wrong? This is why silence didn't work. Outside voices began amplifying the story. Foreign analysts, rival politicians, and global media kept repeating the same uncomfortable idea. Something in the air balance had shifted. And once that narrative escaped the country's control, pretending nothing happened became impossible. The more officials avoided details, the louder the speculation became. Embarrassment might sound like a soft concept, but in military strategy, it's fuel. It accelerates decisions, it shortens timelines, it pushes governments to act before they're fully ready because waiting looks like weakness. At this point, the conversation stopped being about headlines and started becoming about structure. Air forces don't get emotional. They don't sulk or argue online. They look at numbers, readiness rates, and future matchups. And when those spreadsheets start looking worse than expected, procurement offices light up. This is the moment where confidence begins to erode quietly inside meeting rooms. And once that erosion starts, buying decisions stop being optional. Which brings us to the next problem. Because when leaders looked inward for answers, they realized something deeply uncomfortable. Their own domestic fighter program wasn't ready to carry the weight they suddenly needed it to. On paper, the domestic fighter program was supposed to be the solution. A homegrown jet built locally, flying the national flag, proof of independence and technological maturity. Politically, it was perfect. Strategically, it looked promising. But reality doesn't run on slogans. This fighter had been under development for decades, not years, decades. Each delay was explained away. Testing takes time. Safety comes first. Improvements are ongoing. All of that sounds reasonable, until you remember one thing. Enemies don't pause their own programs to be polite. In real combat planning, time is unforgiving. A fighter that will be ready in 5 years is useless if the threat arrives in 3. Worse, the jet wasn't truly domestic. Its heart, the engine, came from abroad. So did key avionics, sensors, and critical subsystems. That means production speed wasn't controlled at home. It depended on foreign factories, foreign approvals, and foreign supply chains. In peacetime, that's manageable. In crisis, it's a choke point. Here's the contradiction no one likes to say out loud. National pride pushes leaders to field the aircraft early, but operational reality demands maturity. When those two collide, pilots pay the price. An immature platform doesn't deter the enemy. It puts a human being into a machine that hasn't fully earned trust yet. This isn't about mocking engineering efforts or dismissing ambition. Every serious aviation power has struggled with indigenous fighters at first. The problem is timing. When political calendars move faster than industrial progress, air forces get stuck with equipment that exists on slides, not in squadrons. And once leaders realized this program couldn't scale fast enough, couldn't deploy fast enough, and couldn't reassure commanders fast enough, they had to look elsewhere. That's when a temporary solution quietly became the centerpiece. At this stage, the problem wasn't choosing the best fighter. It was choosing the only one that could arrive in time. Look at the alternatives. American fighters were effectively off the table. Politics had turned hostile. Export approvals were uncertain, and even the United States itself was struggling with production backlogs. Buying from the U.S. isn't like ordering a phone. You need alignment, trust, and spare industrial capacity. None of those were guaranteed. Russian fighters weren't a clean option either. Russia's own war had swallowed up production lines, spare parts, and attention. On top of that, pressure from Western sanctions made long-term support risky. Buying a jet you can't reliably maintain is like buying a sports car with no access to fuel. That narrowed the field fast. The Rafale didn't win because it was cheap. It didn't win because it was unbeatable. It won because it was available. It had an existing production line, combat experience, and a supplier willing to talk immediately. In a crisis, availability beats perfection every time. This is where the paradox appears. The price was extremely high. The performance had already been questioned in combat narratives, and yet the urgency only grew stronger. Because this purchase wasn't about dominance, it was about survival in the short term. Think of it like a city facing a sudden water shortage. They don't wait 10 years to build the perfect dam. They buy tankers. Expensive, inefficient tankers, because people need water now. That's what Rafale became. A flying water tanker for an air force under pressure. Its real role wasn't to scare rivals into submission. It was to hold the line, to prevent the balance from collapsing while deeper problems, training, engines, industry, remained unresolved. But even this stopgap ran into a hard limit. A limit that doesn't care about money, politics, or pride. Engines. Most people think fighter strength is about how many jets you buy. They're wrong. What actually determines the size of an air force is engines. A modern fighter jet without an engine is just an expensive metal shell. You can have hangars full of airframes, radar systems ready, pilots trained, but if engines aren't available, nothing flies. And engines are the hardest part of the entire system to produce. Each one takes years of precision manufacturing, rare materials, and extremely specialized factories. You can't suddenly ramp up engine production the way you scale smartphone factories. It's more like growing a tree than printing a poster. Right now, the global engine supply chain is under stress. Rare earth materials are tightly controlled. Specialized alloys are in short supply. Even the biggest military industries are struggling to meet their own demand. When supply tightens, exporters take care of themselves first. This is why the idea of mass-producing cheaper fighters, or even building decoys, falls apart. Every decoy still needs an engine, and engines aren't optional. Without them, you don't even get a distraction, let alone combat power. Here's the brutal logic. If you can't secure engines, you can't scale numbers. And if you can't scale numbers, numerical strategies collapse before they even start. At this point, the challenge stopped being strategic or political. No speech, alliance, or budget vote could fix it quickly. This was industrial physics, the kind of limit that doesn't bend for elections or emergencies. And once leaders understood this, another demand suddenly made sense. If engines and parts are scarce, you don't just want finished jets delivered. You want control over assembly, timelines, and counting. That's why local production became non-negotiable. On the surface, local assembly sounds like patriotism. Jobs, factories, self-reliance. That's the version sold to the public. But inside military planning rooms, the reasons are far more practical and far more political. Local assembly stretches time. When fighters are assembled domestically, delivery schedules become flexible. A jet can be labeled in production, nearing completion, or awaiting final integration for months. That breathing room matters when pressure is rising and numbers are being watched closely. It also blurs visibility. Outside observers can count imported fighters easily. Each one arrives with a flight, a ceremony, a serial number. Locally assembled aircraft are harder to track. Parts arrive quietly. Final assembly happens behind closed doors. Inventory becomes fuzzier, and that uncertainty is useful. This isn't about deception in a dramatic sense. It's about narrative control. If losses happen, replacements don't need to be announced loudly. They just appear. Accounting stays flexible. Confidence stays intact, at least on the surface. There's another layer too. Politics. Military timelines don't exist in a vacuum. Elections don't wait for production delays. Leaders need visible progress. Contracts signed, factories running, jets rolling out. Local assembly creates milestones that can be showcased, even if real combat readiness is still catching up. In other words, controlling the sky requires controlling the clock, and controlling the clock requires domestic assembly. But all of this, stretching time, managing perception, holding the line, only makes sense if a bigger shock is coming. And one is. Because across the border, a different kind of aircraft is approaching the picture. One that changes calculations before it even takes off. Here's the part that turns urgency into panic. The potential arrival of a fifth-generation fighter, Pakistan's J-35, changes the equation before a single missile is fired. That's because fifth-generation aircraft don't just fight better. They force the other side to rethink everything. Radar coverage, patrol patterns, response times, even pilot psychology. You don't need hundreds of them. You don't even need them fully deployed. The possibility is enough. A fifth-generation jet operates differently. It sees first, shoots first, and leaves before you realize what happened. Older fighters can still fight, but only if they have numbers, coordination, and constant readiness. That's why the conversation suddenly shifts away from best jet to how many can we keep in the air, every day. This is where Rafale's role becomes clear again. It's not a counter, it's a buffer. Against a fifth-generation threat, quality alone isn't enough. You need coverage, more sorties, more pilots trained, more aircraft ready on short notice. Training and doctrine become the last adjustable knobs. You can't invent new engines overnight. You can't magically field a stealth jet tomorrow. But you can fly more, drill harder, and try to close the gap with discipline. That's why the urgency feels different now. It's not fear of war tomorrow. It's fear of imbalance setting in quietly, month by month, until one side realizes it can no longer deter the other with confidence. The clock isn't counting down to explosions. It's counting down to asymmetry. And once that happens, every decision made earlier, what was delayed, denied, or rushed, comes back for payment. In the end, this story isn't about one speech, one fighter jet, or even one country. It's about a simple rule that never changes. You can delay reality, but you can't cancel it. Narratives buy time. Denials soften headlines. Procurement announcements create the appearance of control. But none of those things generate engines, shorten production cycles, or train pilots faster. They're temporary shields, useful but fragile. Modern air power doesn't reward confidence alone. It rewards industrial depth, supply chain resilience, and honest assessments of capability. When those foundations are weak, even the most confident messaging eventually cracks. That's why rushed deals happen. That's why stopgaps become centerpieces. That's why local assembly, timelines, and perception suddenly matter as much as raw performance. And this lesson goes far beyond this case. In modern warfare, countries aren't punished first for losing battles. They're punished for misjudging themselves. So the real takeaway is this: don't just listen to what leaders say. Watch what they buy. Watch what they rush. Watch what they suddenly refuse to talk about. And most importantly, watch the supply chains. Because slogans don't fly aircraft. Engines do. When something is hurried, defended loudly, and explained carefully, that's usually where the fear lives.